On the 29th of October 2023, the Republic of Turkey will have celebrated 100 years. Since its founding in the wake of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, 1923 marked the end of over 600 years of Ottoman imperial rule, which had the pinnacle of its power in the mid-16th century dominated lands across much of the Middle East, Europe, rising from relative obscurity as a minor regional power in northwestern Anatolia. The Ottoman dynasty would usher in a period of remarkable territorial expansion, coupled with rapid advancements in governmental systems that allowed for one of the most diverse and prosperous empires in the world to flourish. Mighty and powerful state, and how that it shaped the modern Turkish nation of today. This is the history of the Ottoman Empire. How the Ottoman Empire came to be established could not be fully understood without first providing some context on the migration of the Turkic peoples out of Eastern Asia. Since ancient times, the Turks, who were themselves originally an Asiatic people, had gradually migrated from northeastern Asia and headed westwards across the vast Eurasian steppe. By the 7th century, they were in the region around the Altai Mountains, near the borders of what is now Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. From there, they continued to move further south and westward in the centuries that followed, before a number of them settled into a semi-nomadic way of life in an area around the Caspian and Aral Seas. One of the main Turkic tribes that came to inhabit this area were the Ogres. However, sometime in the late 10th century, clans that made up this tribe, a man by the name of Seljuk, decided to break off from the main tribal group and established his own dynasty. Over the subsequent decades of the new millennium, Seljuk Empire, by expanding into Persia, they were greatly influenced by the Persian language and culture, which they soon adopted for themselves, as well as converting to Islam. By the 1060s, they advanced all the way up to the borders of the Byzantine Empire in western Anatolia. Sporadic clashes between the two powers eventually culminated in the outbreak of the Byzantine War at the Battle of Manzikars in 1071. The Seljuks inflicted a crushing defeat on the Byzantine army, which effectively allowed them to gain control of the Near East and push deeper into what is now Turkey. Over the next 2 centuries, the empire gradually declined and fragmented into a patchwork of smaller Turkic states. The Turks themselves, however, continue to hold a major presence in Anatolia, notably in the shape of the Sultanate of Rum. Although this too would eventually decline and fragment by the turn of the 14th century, resulting in a number of even smaller principalities known as the Anatolian Beyliks scattered across the region. It was here, amongst the tribes of northwestern Turkey, that a warlord emerged as the founder of what would become Ottoman Empire. Although the sources for his life and reign remain unreliable and undetailed, he is credited as the founder of the dynasty. The boy, his namesake, Osman, the century or so after Osman's reign, would be characterized by the trying to conquer the last vestiges of the Byzantine Empire, which had once ruled over most of the eastern Mediterranean by the 14th century. However, this was now reduced to the southern portion of the Balkans, mainland Greece, the Greek islands, as well as a small amount of territory in Turkey. Their empire was ruled from Constantinople, the most formidable ruled city in the medieval world, and one which had withstood many sieges over the centuries if the Ottomans were to expand beyond northwestern Turkey. They would have to do so at the expense of the Byzantines. A major step forward occurred in 1331 when the city of Nicaea fell to the Turks. Some years later, in 1369, Adrianople, a city just 200 kilometers Constantinople near the borders of Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey, today also fell to the Turks and was turned into their capital for a short time, while further conquests Serbia and Bulgaria followed. A brief period of internal turmoil occurred within the Ottoman Empire in the first decades of the 15th century, but in 1451 Mehmed II was restored to the Ottoman Sultanate and determined to conquer Constantinople once and for all in early April 1453, which lasted for 7 weeks before the walls were breached and the Ottoman army flooded in. Fittingly, Constantine XI, who shared his name with Constantine I, the original founder of the city, Constantine XI fell in the fighting of the 29th of May 1453, and the city itself fell to the Ottomans later. Constantinople then became the capital of the burgeoning Ottoman Empire, as a statement of the Ottoman-esque conquest of the city. The Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which had been built by the emperor Elvire. The 4 minaret towers at each corner of the complex being added. Shortly afterwards, they advance all the way up to the borders of the Byzantine Empire in western Anatolia. Sporadic clashes between the two powers eventually culminated in the outbreak of the Byzantines' war at the Battle of Manzikars in 1071. The Seljuks inflicted a crushing defeat on the Byzantine army, which effectively allowed them to gain control of the Near East and push deeper into what is now Turkey. Over the next 2 centuries, empire gradually declined and fragmented into a patchwork of smaller Turkic states. The Turks themselves, however, continue to hold a major presence in Anatolia, notably in the shape of the Sultanate of Rum, although this too would eventually decline and fragment by the turn of the 14th century, resulting in a number of even smaller principalities known as the Anatolian Beyliks, scattered across the region. It was here, amongst the tribes northwestern Turkey, that a warlord emerged as the founder of what would become the Ottoman Empire. Although the sources for his life reign remain unreliable and undetailed, he is credited as the founder of the dynasty. The boy, his namesake, Osman, the century or so after Osman's reign, would be characterized by the Ottomans trying to conquer the last vestiges of the Byzantine Empire, which had once ruled over most of the eastern Mediterranean by the 14th century. However, this was now reduced to the southern portion of the Balkans, mainland Greece, the Greek islands, as well as a small amount of territory in Turkey. Their empire was ruled from Constantinople, the most formidable ruled city in the medieval world, and one which had withstood many sieges over the centuries if the Ottomans were to expand beyond northwestern Turkey. They would have to do so at the expense of the Byzantines and take their capital city for themselves. A major step forward occurred in 1331, when the city of Nicaea fell to the Turks. Some years later, in 1369, Adrianople, a city just 200 kilometers from Constantinople near the borders of Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey, today, also fell too. The Turkson was turned into their capital for a short time, while further conquests in Serbia and Bulgaria followed. A brief period of internal turmoil occurred within the Ottoman Empire in the first decades of the 15th century, but in 1451, Mehmed II was restored to the Ottoman Sultanate and determined to conquer Constantinople once and for all. April 1453, he laid siege to the great city, which lasted for 7 weeks before the walls were breached, and the Ottoman army flooded in fittingly. Constantine XI, who shared his name with Constantine I, the original founder of the city over 1,000 years earlier and whose eponym he had bestowed upon it, Constantine XI fell in the fighting of the 29th of May. 1453, and the city itself fell to the Ottomans later that same day. Constantinople then became the capital of the burgeoning Ottoman Empire as a statement of the Ottoman conquest of the city. The Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which had been built by the Emperor Justinian over 900 years earlier, was the 4 minaret towers at each corner of the complex being added. Shortly afterwards, Constantinople were just the beginning of the rise of the Ottoman Empire in a century that followed. The Turks set out on a course of expansion, conquest across the eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, North Africa, and into the Balkans and Black Sea in the early 1460s. Too quickly overran Maria in Greece, the Empire of Trebizond in northern Turkey, and then Bosnia in the Balkans. By the time he died in 1481, he had expanded into southern and eastern Turkey, conquered Albania, and also sent an expedition to the Crimean Peninsula. In the mid-1470s, his successor Bayezid II was just as formidable a warlord, and during his 30-year reign he added new territories to the empire in Syria and the Levant, after defeating the Mamluks of Egypt in a war for dominance of that region. Additionally, he also consolidated Ottoman control over the Aegean Sea after battling against the Republic of Venice, who controlled many of the islands. 1499 and 1503. His successor Selim I is also noteworthy despite only ruling for 8 years. 1512 and 1520, but nevertheless conquered virtually all of North Africa. In 1517, his armies defeated the Monroes at the Battle of Radania, Egypt, and much of Libya under Ottoman control, while Hayred and Barbarossa the ruler of much of Algeria and Tunisia, agreed to become an Ottoman vassal in 1519, perhaps the most famous sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and one who above all others undertook its greatest expansion to the height of its power, was Suleiman, 1520 and 1566. His sultanship witnessed the Ottomans emerge as one of the foremost global powers, as he completed the conquest of much of the Balkans, and took his armies all the way to the gates of Vienna, which he unsuccessfully besieged in 1529. He also secured the island of Rhodes from the Christian Knights of St. John in 1522, captured the city of Tripoli in North Africa in 1551, and expanded into the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq. By the time his reign ended, Ottoman rule extended from Hungary, sea south towards Egypt and Oman, and from Algeria in the west to the shores of the Caspian Sea. In the east, much of the success of the Ottomans' expansion was owed to the proficiency of its military, which incorporated a cohesive balance of infantry, cavalry, and artillery that was unmatched during its heyday. Amongst the elite troops were soldiers known as janissaries. These were men who were captured as child slaves from Christian lands in southwestern Europe and forced to convert to Islam. They were then incorporated into the Ottoman army under strict codes of discipline and professionalism, which made them an extremely effective fighting force. From this position of power, in the early 16th century, the Ottomans would consolidate their efforts and spend the next 2 centuries waging war against Christendom in Western and Central Europe. This became a multi-pronged conflict, with much of the initial effort spent fighting for dominance of the Mediterranean against the preeminent power in the region. Spain at that time, the Spanish controlled much of southern Italy and the Italian islands, and took it upon themselves to check the advance of the Muslim Ottoman, leading coalitions of Christian forces against them for decades. Armadas were sent back and forth between the Turks and the Spanish, culminating in 2 major clashes in 1565 and 1571. The first of these was the Great Siege of Malta, during which the Ottomans tried to capture the island from the Knights of St. John, who had been granted it by the Spanish crown as compensation for the loss of the island of Rhodes to the Turks decades earlier. The siege ended in failure for the Ottomans, and 6 years later their advancement of the Mediterranean would be halted further by another Spanish-led Christian alliance, which sent a huge armada against them in 1571, which took place off the coast of northwestern Greece, involved over 400 ships and 130,000 men, and ended with another defeat. Ottomans. Although this proved to the Christian powers that the threat from the Turks could be contained to some extent, this setback from the Ottoman perspective merely shifted their focus to other areas of Europe, where they wished to expand into ever since their victory over the Hungarians at the Battle of Mahax in 1526. Complete control over Central Europe lay tantalizingly within the Ottomans' grasp, were it not for the Austrian capital of Vienna barring the way across the river Danube. Although they had failed in their previous attempts to take the city, In 1529, under the leadership of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a new siege. Vienna in 1683. Despite fielding an army of over 150,000 men, the Ottomans could not take the city, and when a Christian Holy League relief force, led by the Polish king John III, Sobieski arrived on the 12th of September, they were routed before the walls in what was the largest cavalry charge in history, with 18,000 horsemen charging into the Turks' incumbent. The defeat at Vienna marked a turning point for the Ottoman advance into Europe, after which they would gain no further ground on the continent as the late 17th century progressed into the early 18th, to slowly stagnate and enter into a relative period of decline. Much of this was owed to the complacency of the sultans of this period, backseat approach to the governorship of their empire, to the Ottoman system of government, which was headquartered in the Topkapi Palace. And Constantinople had generally seen active and engaged sultans take a direct role in the affairs of the empire, especially early on in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, with each passing generation, the day-to-day decision-making increasingly fell to the Grand Vizier, who acted as prime minister, and a small army of officials and administrators. All the while, the sultans passed much of their time away in their harems and gardens. The governance of the empire would largely decentralized in its approach, insofar as taxes were collected from the provinces to maintain a large army, but the regions themselves also had a fair degree of autonomy. Under local rulers and governors, it was also a tolerant empire. Whilst conversion to Islam was beneficial to those looking to advance at the social hierarchy, it was by no means mandatory. Christians and other religious adherents were accepted under the Ottoman Empire, and it even became a primary haven for Europe's Jews who faced persecution, expulsion from countries like Spain during this era. Cities such as Thessaloniki became centers of religious cosmopolitanism in the early modern era, with the majority of 54% of its population Jewish by as early as 1519. The Ottoman Empire was also initially a very wealthy one, with extensive trade networks that flowed from as far afield as India and China along the Silk Road through two cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Egypt, as well as Antioch and Damascus in the Levant. Over time, however, as the center of world economic activity shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, carrying trade out of the Americas and the Far East, effectively bypassed the Ottomans' reliance on the overland trade routes that passed through their territory, effectively making them obsolete. The Ottoman Empire began to fall behind its European rivals, who are themselves experiencing a scientific revolution, with developments being made on all fronts due to rapid advancements in technology. As the 18th century progressed, the Ottoman position came to be seen as less of a threat and more of a weakness that could be exploited with the lands they had conquered in centuries past. Now looking ripe for reclamation, Russia and Austria in particular began to take the fights to the Turks, who were eager to see the Ottoman presence in the region decline for their own benefit. A year later, the nominal Ottoman Algeria was ended entirely when France invaded and began establishing its own colony there throughout the 19th century. But more notably, during the 1850s, Russia looked to expedite the decline of the Ottoman Empire further by advancing into their territories around the Black Sea. Unlike in previous instances where the Western Christian powers sought to capitalize on such an opportunity, enjoying the fighting against the Turks, Britain and France, or exerting influence, they subsequently joined the conflict in defense of the Ottoman Empire, with the Crimean War being fought successfully to bring much-needed respite to the declining power of the Turks. Nevertheless, in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, numerous new countries emerged out of the Ottoman provinces in the Balkans as Romania and Serbia declared themselves independent, and Bulgaria became increasingly autonomous. The Empire of Austria-Hungary and Russia once again continued in their relentless attacks at the expense of the Ottomans in the Balkans and the Caucasus. By the early 1910s, when Italy had seized Libya from their control and Albania had established itself as an independent nation, there were growing talks amongst the European powers of dissecting what remained the Ottoman Empire and dividing it up between themselves. This seemingly never-ending period of decline. 2. Growing concerns amongst the Ottoman Empire's younger generations, many of whom identified as Turkish nationalists and called for political reforms to mitigate the empire's downturn and hopefully rejuvenate its prospects after 200 years of stagnation. At the forefront of this movement, the Young Turks, a group which wanted to replace the centuries-old governmental system of sultan and ministers with a modern constitutional monarchy alongside a Western-style parliament and civil service. In 1908, they launched a revolution which successfully managed to usher in a period of constitutional government. The Young Turks were a loosely formed alliance of various political groups, including liberals, academics, and also more conservative elements, including the military. As a result, they were unable to rule by consensus or agreement. After the revolution of 1908, and 4 years into the 1910s, the Ottoman state continued to have tumultuous internal politics, which only exacerbated the empire's collapse. Ultimately, the end for the Ottoman Empire would come from both within and without, being inextricably linked to the outbreak of the First World War. Up until this point, the Turks had avoided becoming involved. The two main military alliances that had developed amongst the European great powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These are the Triple Entente, Russia and Britain, and the Triple Alliance powers of Germany, Austria, Italy. When conflict finally broke out in the summer of 1914, the Turks saw an opportunity to push back against the Russian advancements made over the past century, and so decided to join Germany alongside Austria-Hungary and Italy as part of the Central Powers. The Ottomans had mixed fortunes during the war. On the one hand, they scored a major victory against the British and Anzac forces during the Gallipoli campaign, but in the Middle East, in the Levant, they lost much of their tour.